When most people think of the south end of the San Francisco Bay, they generally think of man-made things. The Monterey Bay Aquarium, the verdant strawberry patches and vegetable farms that produce most of America's strawberries and other fruits and vegetables, and slightly north Silicon Valley, the home of the world's most valuable companies, all of them focused on tech and the heart of the artificial intelligence boom. Maybe the more literary think of John Steinbeck's vivid novels like Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men, set in the Salinas Valley along the coast. But within a short drive of both the agricultural bounty of the Santa Clara Valley, John Steinbeck's home, and the bustle of Silicon Valley, two of America's rarest salamanders lead a fragile existence in highly fragmented habitat of California live oaks and wetlands. Both the Santa Cruz long-toed salamander, which is restricted only to Santa Cruz and Monterey County wetlands and the surrounding woods, and the California tiger salamander, which is more widely distributed through the Golden State but is nonetheless federally endangered, migrate in the first cold, hard rains of California's winter rainy season, which normally happens in November or December. In mid-November last year, I went looking for these critters crossing rural roads by flashlight, and it was a highly successful trip, observing both species. But in addition to that more conventional field herping video, I wanted to take a look at the economics of conservation for these species in the Monterey Bay area, and in particular to look at the role of road tunnels in reducing road mortality for migrating amphibians and enabling development to continue and to coincide with conservation. Along the road that I walked that particular night, road mortality is very low since traffic is also very low, and the few people that live along the road are mostly aware of the species' migratory habits to boot. But that's not true everywhere in the salamander's range. This is California State Highway 1, the main thoroughfare through most of the Santa Cruz long-toed salamander's habitat. And since the mid-20th century, when it became a freeway, a formidable barrier to salamanders seeking to migrate to their breeding ponds, notably Valencia Lagoon, which sits immediately adjacent to the roadway and has harbored the species since detection in 1954. Well, since long before that, but that's when the population was discovered. The expansion of roadways is an inevitable outgrowth of a growing economy and a growing population, often a sign of an economy that's developing at a healthy pace. However, it's also one of the primary sources of mortality for America's reptiles and amphibians, and especially slower-moving animals like the burly rattlesnakes of the American Southwest and lumbering salamanders of the genus Ambystoma, to which both the Santa Cruz long-toed and California tiger salamander belong. Since both species migrate en masse during heavy rain events, if they encounter busy roads, a large percentage of breeding adults become one of the saddest sights in field herpetology, dead-on-road or DOR specimens. In front of us hit him, right up there on the neck, so he's in the kind of in his final death throes of becoming a DOR. Beside outright pollution of breeding areas, much of which has ameliorated with cleaner industrial technology and regulation since the 1960s and the 1970s, or critical habitat destruction, which is limited by both the Endangered Species Act and state-level laws, and the efforts of private groups that we're going to discuss just briefly a little bit later. Road mortality is probably the clearest threat to both species, and especially the very range-limited Santa Cruz long-toed salamander. One way to reduce road mortality is simply not to build roads, but that obviously isn't always possible, and roads are often necessary if development is going to spread into a new area, or if people are going to live there, or if travel times are going to be reduced between two places. So another way to reduce road mortality is to make sure that the animals don't get on the road in the first place. Now, with larger animals like moose or deer or something, this requires big, tall fences. But with amphibians, there are tunnels that go beneath roadways, and when coupled with a wall design that sort of funnels the animals toward the tunnel, or a drift fence, it'll catch the salamanders en route to the breeding site, direct them toward the tunnel entrance and ensure that they pass under the road safely. It's been widely adopted in Europe and in a few places in the northeastern U.S. to ensure that development and the health of wildlife are less in conflict. And the idea is that salamanders are moving from the uplands on this side of the road to the breeding pond on the other side of the road. They hit that drift fence, and then still wanting to go downhill toward the breeding pond, they follow it until they hit the culvert. In California, multiple tunnels have been constructed since the technique gained traction in the 1990s in the Northeast, with one under California State Highway 1 on this exact stretch that we drove along. And there are a few more in a gated community that sits adjacent to a different breeding pool for Santa Cruz long-toed salamanders. Studies from some sources in the northeastern U.S. with spotted salamander migrations in Massachusetts indicate about 2/3 of the salamanders successfully pass through these tunnels to the pools, while the rest are at least kept off roads. However, in the case of Santa Cruz long-toed salamanders, this study from Mark Alabach and David Lambs in the early 2000s indicated that while the setup dramatically reduced road mortality, it resulted in only about 9% of the marked salamanders on the upslope side getting through the tunnels and to their breeding ponds. Although 29 salamanders in the study that evaded detection on the upslope side and were not marked did also pass through the tunnels, indicating the success rate may have been substantially above the 9% calculated. So one way we can think about what these tunnels are doing economically is that they are reducing the marginal damage, which is our upward red curve and also our green curve, and why it's 2 I'll explain in a second, of any given level of development for the amphibians. So the damage curve is upward sloping because basically it's a supply curve. The more you want to produce, the more inputs there are. Consuming inputs is a cost. And in this context, the more development is happening, the more land that's going to take up, or the more habitat disturbance that is, so that's a cost. You're getting something out of it, constructing a new house, new business, whatever, but you're also consuming a resource to get it. Okay, and we're measuring that in damage instead of just putting a generic S for supply curve. So what we notice is there's this initial marginal damage curve without mitigation practices, okay? So without the tunnels. Let's just focus specifically on the salamander example. And our y-axis is damage, our x-axis is, let's say, GDP, okay? So for each additional unit of local GDP and local growth, then the damage escalates. What the mitigation factor does, let's say the tunnels, is at any given level of development, it'll push the marginal damage curve downward from this to marginal damage with mitigation. So at any given level of damage, let's say D1, this blue dotted line represents the maximum environmental damage that can occur and the Santa Cruz long-toed salamanders still survive. Then at D1, if we didn't have the tunnels, the most GDP growth that can occur is this right here, GDP 1, because our survivability line intersects our marginal damage curve here. We follow it down to GDP 1. Well, with the tunnels, we can go out here to GDP 2, so that's a lot more growth. Or you can take the trade-off the other way and say, well, we don't want any more GDP growth, or we don't want any more development around here, but how much could the gains to the amphibians be, aka how much less could the damage be? And that's the vertical distance between, at this level of GDP, the red curve and the green curve. So that distance there represents less damage to the environment, less damage to the population of salamanders. You notice that the gap between the red and the green gets wider the further out you go. That's because at some level of really low development, like 5 people live in this whole 10 square miles, there's really no difference between having a salamander tunnel and not. It doesn't matter. Either way, there's very, very low road mortality. Versus the more developed it gets, the bigger the difference of having the mitigation technique. In this concept of thinking about mitigation techniques in terms of what the change to the marginal damage is, and then how much of that increased ability to get more economic growth or more development versus lower the damage, like how to manage that trade-off. Should be 50-50 between the two priorities or whatever. This is applicable to way more stuff besides just salamander tunnels. You could relabel this in about 2 seconds. Reducing acid rain and scrubbers in coal-fired power plants, and the red curve is the marginal damage to forests in the eastern U.S. from acid rain without scrubbers, and the green line is with scrubbers, and the x-axis is tons of coal burned annually, and the y-axis is damage to forests or something like that, or acreage of forest destroyed. So this is a very widely applicable framework to be thinking about mitigation techniques. But beyond migration, the Santa Cruz long-toed and California tiger salamanders are both federally listed as endangered species, meaning that further habitat degradation, not that which already existed at the time of the law, is disallowed. The incentive structure for homeowners, which is why such listings are so controversial in the U.S., is an appropriate subject for a longer episode. But here we want to spend just a brief amount of time looking at how private groups are allowing landowners to capture some of the existence value of the rare salamanders they have crossing their property. For instance, the Santa Cruz Land Trust, the link to whose website is included below this video in the description, buys land to try to reconnect fragmented populations that no longer exchange genes through breeding, and to conserve remaining corridors between protected breeding areas for Santa Cruz long-toed salamanders. Critically, this translates the desire that people have in aggregate to see conservation, but cannot monetize in large enough chunks to purchase land, and delivers that value to landowners so they're compensated for conserving their land rather than converting it to other uses or developing it themselves. This is also what larger groups like the Nature Conservancy are doing. They're aggregating individually small but collectively significant existence value and concentrating it into land purchases and then executing those land purchases. So the idea is, let's say 100,000, and what do I mean by existence value? It's the value people place just in their mind on knowing that a species exists, even if they're never going to see it. Or maybe they want to see it, and they're preserving an option that someday in the future I get to go see it. So let's say that like 1 million people all across America place a $20 value on the Santa Cruz long-toed salamander existing. Well, then its existence value, crudely put, is $20 million. But each one of those people's value is only $20, and so none of them can go purchase it if there's a section of land that's critical to the species that's up for sale. Some other interest is going to win. But if that's all aggregated because they're all donating to the Nature Conservancy or something like this, then that total desire to see the thing conserved can actually get translated into a transaction. And it can beat out, let's say, a mining company that wants to purchase it or whatever. Thank you for joining me in California for this video and for the field herping video that went with it. I hope you found the issues that we explored behind the conservation of some of these Ambystoma fascinating. As always, there's a trade-off between development and conservation, but thinking in terms of mitigation and thinking economically and in terms of trade-offs rather than one or the other has the potential to reduce the cost of that trade-off for everybody involved. I am including a link to the Land Trust of Santa Cruz below if you just want to check out their website or if you want to donate. Thank you for watching and hope you enjoy the video.